We are going to move on to chapter 27, which is actually a companion chapter to the urinary system. Because the urinary system, and we've talked about many of these concepts already, some of this will be review, which you'll enjoy that. But the urinary system is responsible for maintaining the balance of the fluid, electrolytes, and acid-base balance, along with a couple of other systems. So the thing that this chapter does bring in is new ideas that will help you understand the regulation of each of these. There's some universal principles, and that is that water intake needs to equal water output. And so that which you take in needs to equal that which you put out. Now understand that the kidney can do an excellent job with conserving water, but if there's no water coming in, then there's a certain limit as to what it can do. Sources of water can be liquids themselves, but also a lot of foods have high water content, particularly fruits and vegetables. You do have additional water that's produced by metabolic processes. Think of the Krebs cycle that's going to create water at the end as that electron acceptor at the end. And the losses of water, vaporization out of the lungs, perspiration, and water, it leaves the body in feces because it needs to be lubricated to pass through, even though that's what's happening in the large intestines is the waste product is being compressed. And urine production is a way that water is lost. The human body is made up of mostly water. You have water inside the cell and outside the cell. That inside the cell water is called intercellular fluid, and that's the bulk of water, and you're about 60% water, depending on males or females. The bulk of water, and about 22% is outside the cell or extracellular fluid. Of that extracellular fluid, about 80% of it is interstitial. So that means it is lymph, synovial, cerebral fluids, cerebral spinal fluid, GI tract fluids, and fluids in the eyes and ears. And then the rest of it, 20% of extracellular fluid, is in blood plasma. The anion and cation makeup of intracellular and extracellular fluid shifts quite a bit between the two. The most important one to pay attention to is you have much more potassium inside the cell than outside, and it's vastly different, and much more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. And this image shows you other parts of body makeup between carbohydrates, minerals, and fats, not to mention protein. You're mostly protein of those four. Actually, I guess you're as much fat as protein, depending. And then your oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen products, as well as those trace minerals. The separation of the two compartments is by that famous selectively permeable membrane, that cell membrane, the plasma membrane. And but there is a slight difference between men and women as far as the amount of water. A little bit more water in men than women, and little bit different makeup with regard to solid materials. But very similar makeup between men and women, not that different. There's some basic concepts with regard to regulation of these fluid compartments, and most of the changes that we'll talk about that monitor and adjust the level of fluids are just changes in the extracellular fluid. So most of the changes we talk about will act on the extracellular fluid, not the intracellular fluid. The changes of the extracellular fluid are a little bit more systemic than intracellular. There are no receptors that monitor fluid or electrolyte balance. So it's not necessarily monitored that way, but what is monitored is plasma volume. So if that decreases, or osmotic concentration. So the actual electrolytes individually aren't monitored, but they certainly lead to osmotic concentration and fluid balances. The plasma volume, if that decreases dramatically, then that will be monitored. And then cells cannot move water molecules by active transport. Water is not moved in terms of osmosis. Remember, it's the solutes that are moved across that plasma membrane. It's a passive process. So what happens is, if the cell wants water inside itself, it could bring sodium in, because we know sodium water follows salt. So sodium could be moved back and forth, and water will follow it. And the last basic concept, or basic, I guess, tenet you might say, is the body's content of water or electrolytes will increase if dietary gains increase. And losses to the environment will decrease losses. So your body water and electrolyte will increase if you eat more of them, and it will lose them if it loses them to the environment. So if you're ingesting food that are higher in electrolytes and fluids, then everything will increase. But if you're perspiring and unfortunately have diarrhea or vomiting, etc., then you'll lose them. So these are basic tenets, I guess, basic concepts on the regulation of fluids. Here's your slide of major cation anions, and one of the reasons why I like this, it really shows the dramatic difference. If you look on the far left between in the cation columns, potassium is huge in comparison to sodium inside the cell. Sodium is huge compared to potassium outside the cell, whether you're in the plasma or the interstitial fluid. And then there is a difference in anions. Only chloride tends to be more common in the external cellular fluid than internal. Internal cellular fluid seems to have a larger makeup of anions and more proteins inside, I guess you might say. Speaking of that regulation, remember we talked about the mechanisms that might regulate water compartments, and there are a couple of hormones that help you with this, and antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and natriuretic peptides. These are regulatory hormones. Antidiuretic hormone we've talked about already, that it is there are, you look at osmotic concentration of the extracellular fluid is looked at in terms of changes. And what would happen is, if in fact you have or you have an increase of blood volume, increase of concentration of sodium in the extracellular fluid, I guess I might say that, because we just talked about the tenet about you're not looking at fluid amounts, but you're looking at osmolarity. So increase in sodium content, that in the extracellular, the receptors are stimulated, and then ADH is released to increase thirst, decreased urinary loss. So you're adding to the amount of fluids you're taking in, less loss of water in the urine, additional water dilutes the extracellular fluid, volume increases, and homeostasis is restored. If you go the other direction, where you have a decrease in sodium concentration in the extracellular, remember osmoreceptors are inhibited, decrease of ADH, decreased thirst, and increased water gain, so you have less urine made. and homeostasis is then going to be restored. Aldosterone is the one that if you have aldosterone regulates sodium ion content of extracellular fluid by regulating triggering the renin-aldosterone mechanism, and that will either increase or decrease the amount of sodium, and water follows salt. The the natriuretic peptides. So natriuretic peptides, if there's a disturbance, increased blood pressure or volume is the first one we're looking at. So increase extracellular volume by fluid gain or by sodium gain. You're going to have an increased blood volume, and what's going to happen here, the atria, so the blood coming into the first chamber of the heart, is going to cause that area that muscle to actually stretch, so distension. Then you're going to have this natriuretic peptides released by the cardiac muscles. That then is going to cause an increased sodium loss in urine, increased water loss because water follows sodium, decreased thirst, and an inhibition of ADH, aldosterone, and a couple of other chemicals. Combined effect would be decrease blood volume, decrease blood pressure, and the whole homeostasis will be restored. And then you have the opposite. Well, actually, the opposite would happen also. This is your concept map for aldosterone. What is going to happen? You have decrease in extracellular fluid by volume, by loss of fluid or sodium loss. Decreased blood volume and pressure, and then the endocrine response would be release of renin. Increased aldosterone release, increased ADH released, and the combined effects would be increasing the fluids that are taken up again by the kidney, so that then can be extracellular fluid. We've kind of gone through this before in the urinary chapter. This is just the renin aldosterone. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. Changes in electrolyte balance can cause water to move from one compartment to the other, and that then alters, and so that can happen between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. But generally it will happen first between the extracellular fluid compartments. So the interstitial fluid will lose volume and plasma will lose volume. But there can be a shift between extracellular fluid and the cell fluid. The fluid inside the cell is just that it's not necessarily the first thing to happen. This would be kind of the last thing to happen. Particularly if you have an alter in blood volume and pressure. And actually, if in fact you lose the water inside the cell, it is detrimental to the cell. Compositions are different. Osmotic, generally is osmotic, osmosis is usually kept in equilibrium. So we don't want a fluid shift, but if it happens, it can be reversed as long as it is identified soon enough and the proper mechanisms come into place soon enough. We will pick up on this one when we come back.